Anyway, just so everybody knows, just to start out, you know, you get a choice of who's crazier, living in Baltimore or living in Minnesota. That's probably what we're up against today. These are my disclosures. Probably the one that's most pertinent is the last one. I don't play banjo, but my daughter does. So what's reversomania? Well, it's considered, I think, the increasing use of reverse total shoulder arthroplasty. It's not really a mania, although, as you can see here, there are different forms of mania. It doesn't preclude the use, though, of anatomic arthroplasty, so I still do some anatomic arthroplasties. But anyway, so the ideal arthroplasty, we'll talk about these few things. First, it should be easy to implant. Secondly, there should be wide applications and indications. There should be few complications, should last a long time, and of course, we want happy patients. And one of these processes in this set of slides was designed at Mayo. Anyway, it should be easy to implant. The learning curve, there really aren't many studies on the learning curve for total shoulder arthroplasty. I think as Lisa Gallett said earlier today, or showed earlier today, the hardest part really is exposing the glenoid, but once you get experience, it's not so bad. The learning curve for reverse arthroplasty is sort of all over the place, 10 cases to 100 cases. Probably, it's kind of hard to say, probably depends on the experience of the person. Obviously, anybody can have a disaster like the one in the bottom right. Obviously, the expertise and how much you've done really does influence your results. Over time, the application for total shoulder arthroplasty has gotten more and more narrow. We used to use it for a lot of things because we didn't have reverses, but it's primarily used for osteoarthritis and people with minimal bone loss. You prefer to put it in somebody who has an intact rotator cuff, and maybe patients who have early rheumatoid arthritis who don't have a lot of bone loss. The reverse, however, can be used for a lot of things. You can use it for cuff tear arthropathy, osteoarthritis where they have a cuff tear, glenoid bone loss, failed anythings, hemiarthroplasties, totals, resurfacing. You can use a reverse. Dislocation arthropathy, recent study came out showing that they do much better with the reverse than they do with totals, primarily because of subscap failure. You can use reverses in all sorts of dysplasias that in the past you wouldn't be able to do it, and also in rheumatoid disease where cuff failure is almost a rule of thumb over time with those patients, and you can get really good results and not have to worry about it. So just everybody knows this is a type A2 or C, actually it's a type C, I apologize, glenoid, and the patient has very limited range of motion. You would never think about putting a total in this, but you can put in a reverse and woohoo, life is good. So anyway, so bone loss is a good indication. Rotator cuff dysfunction, you know, in the old days we'd put a hemi in this person and they wouldn't get very much range of motion. And this is a patient's had several failed rotator cuff repairs with superior subluxation, obvious superior escape. And again, you do a reverse and life is good. So the other is revision cases. This is a 85-year-old retired plastic surgeon who'd had 5 previous operations, 3 failed cuff repairs. It converted to a total, oddly enough, that failed. They took out his glenoid, and then he had to have a brachial plexus exploration. So here he is. His motion's not so good. He's got lots of pain, can't sleep, and you do a reverse, and the guy's happy as a clam, and he can now do everything he wants to do. As far as the complications, total shoulders, the complication rate actually in the literature is about 8% for total shoulder arthroplasty if you look at systematic reviews. Has been mentioned multiple times, and particularly in Joaquin's talk today, glenoid loosening is probably the biggest issue, particularly over time. The failure rate with bone grafting also can be as high as 20%. So I have to say I never really got very good at it, so I try to avoid glenoid bone grafting at all costs. Reverse total shoulder arthroplasty, the early complication rates were as high as 80%, which in the early 2000s was probably just indicates some of the complexity of the components and also lack of experience. But there's a totally different set of complications really than total shoulder arthroplasty, and we've seen substantial reductions in time in terms of the rates over time, so that they actually now approximate that of total shoulders. Now, this hasn't been published yet, but Friedman's presented this at the meetings. They looked at their experience comparing complications for total shoulder arthroplasty and reverse total shoulder arthroplasty over about a 10-year period. And oddly enough, the overall complication rate for the total shoulder arthroplasties was higher than it was for the reverses. And there was a fairly significant difference in the complication rate, as we've talked about multiple times today. Rotator cuff failure, and asymmetric glenoid bone loosening have become really the major causes of failure for total shoulder arthroplasty over time, whether you use a keel component or a peg component. Reverse total shoulder arthroplasty, oddly enough, the most common thing was scapular fractures, but the glenoid loosening has become less of a problem with the more modern implants, and as people have gotten better at it, instability is just about nil compared to the 8 to 10% reported by Frankel in the early 2000s. So in terms of the overall complication rate, some of them are similar, like nerve injury and continued pain, et cetera, but in terms of the big-time complications, reverse actually came out ahead, strangely enough. If you look at survival then, the 5-year survival rates, looking at systematic reviews, at 5 years pretty much everything looks pretty good. Reverses and totals have about the same survival rate, regardless of which study you look at. However, you start looking at the longest term follow-ups, the survival rate, now we're talking survival rate means no operation to remove the component or alter the components. The overall survival rate, as Joaquin mentioned earlier today from the Mayo study, is 81%. Now that's people who've had further surgery. So there's another 20% though where the implants are loose enough and cause enough pain to consider being revised, but the patient just doesn't have the surgery. So the survival rate for total shoulder arthroplasties at 15 to 20 years is slightly diminished compared to what we think it is. And I've been doing this long enough to have some of those patients come back now at 15 years, and their glenoid's loose, but they don't have much pain and they don't want further surgery. Reverse total shoulder arthroplasty, the only long-term study really, and it was a systematic review which included a lot of early experience, was the one by Gerber that was recently published, and 85% is probably, I don't know how realistic that is or isn't, but 10-year studies, though, are still showing pretty good survival rates. So in terms of longevity, though, it's still really the biggest concern with both of these implants, glenoid loosening with total shoulders and long-term cuff failure. An article by Walsh in that group and JBJS showed that the space between the acromion and the humeral head diminishes significantly over time in total shoulder arthroplasty. And so they kind of warned about the possibility that total shoulder arthroplasty doesn't really change the natural history of rotator cuff disease. Reverse total shoulder arthroplasty, though, you have the advantage that you don't have to worry about the rotator cuff. You do have to worry, though, about base plate loosening, which oddly enough now in more modern series is only about 1% compared to the 10% of Frankel's. Notching, we still don't, a lot of patients still get notching. We're not sure if that leads to enough particle disease for them to get loose. There's been a couple studies suggesting that patients lose strength in their shoulder about 8 to 10 years after arthroplasty, but that's also not really well proven in the literature. So the last goal, of course, is to have happy patients. You want people who have good range of motion and are very happy. So how many people think the total shoulder is on the left? Anybody? How many people think the total shoulder is on the right? Not the right shoulder. Well, of course, this is about Reversomania. They both had reverses. So in conclusion, there's different kinds of mania. Reverse total shoulder in some ways is easier than totals. Total shoulders have had increasing limited indications. Reverses have wider indications and they do quite well. Oddly enough, the complication rates are kind of similar, and if anything, in some ways reverses are more predictable, and they particularly are more predictable when you have glenoid bone loss. So I think it's really clear that if you're going to take a chance, do it with a reverse, because the total's got a good chance of failing over 10 to 15 years. Thanks very much.